Silence fell thick in Evergreen Academy's elite physics seminar. Arrogant Dr. Finch mockingly dared Mary Jackson, the quiet, older black janitor cleaning the room, to solve the quantum equation baffling his prodigies. Cruel snickers rippled through the privileged students, expecting her swift humiliation. But Mary, decades of silenced brilliance and forgotten dreams stirring within her, met Finch's icy gaze, took the offered chalk, and began her walk toward the board. Witness the breathtaking tension as raw genius, hidden beneath a janitor's uniform, prepares to shatter every smug assumption in an unforgettable stand. The hushed reverence of Evergreen Academy wasn't just for the towering redwood beams or the original abstract expressionist canvases adorning its halls. It was for the perceived intellectual stratosphere its students inhabited, the legacy of wealth and influence that permeated the very air, scented faintly with old money and organic floor cleaner. Mary Jackson knew that scent intimately. For 18 years, her hands, etched with the map of quiet labor, had buffed the gleam onto those floors, erased the smudges from windows overlooking the manicured quad, and emptied bins overflowing with discarded drafts of brilliance and privilege. She moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn corridors, her presence a necessary but largely unacknowledged fact, like the plumbing or the electrical wiring. Mary, with her tightly coiled, silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the deep, steady calm of someone who had seen storms and survived, was simply there. A fixture. Students, clad in effortless, expensive casual wear, drifted past, their conversations buzzing with talk of venture capital internships, theoretical physics, and summer plans in the south of France. Their glances, if they fell on her at all, were brief, incurious, tinged with the unconscious classification that separated them from her. The epicenter of Evergreen's intellectual arrogance resided in room 307, the domain of Dr. Alastair Finch. Renowned, published, devastatingly sharp, Finch taught the advanced seminar in quantum mechanics, a class populated by prodigies destined for Ivy Leagues and Nobel-adjacent careers. He possessed a chilling precision in his thought and speech, matched only by a subtle, almost surgical disdain for anything, or anyone, he deemed intellectually inferior. He never uttered overt slurs, but his condescension was a palpable force, particularly directed towards those whose labor made his rarefied existence possible. That Tuesday morning, the tension in room 307 was thick enough to distort the light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the vast whiteboard, an equation sprawled, a complex tangle of tensors and integrals describing quantum entanglement under speculative high-energy conditions. Finch's prize students, the best minds Evergreen could boast, were stumped. Foreheads furrowed, styluses tapped nervously against tablets, frustrated sighs punctuated the silence. Mary entered soundlessly, her cart laden with cleaning supplies, intending only to empty the wastebasket near the door. But Finch, pacing before the whiteboard like a dissatisfied deity, spotted her. A flicker of something, amusement? Cruel inspiration? Crossed his normally impassive features. "Ah, Mary," he called out, his voice cutting through the strained silence, smooth as polished ice. The students startled, turning their bewildered gazes towards the janitor hovering by the door. "Perhaps you could offer some insight? You've observed our struggles long enough." He gestured towards the intimidating equation with a flick of his wrist, a gesture less of invitation and more of dismissal, highlighting the absurdity. "This little conundrum seems to have baffled our resident geniuses. Why don't you give it a try?" A few stifled snickers rippled through the room. Not loud laughter, but the quiet, sharp kind that slices deeper, born of ingrained superiority and the thrill of witnessing an expected humiliation. Mary froze, the plastic handle of her cart suddenly cold and alien in her grip. Finch's eyes, pale blue and devoid of warmth, held hers. There was no overt malice, just a vast, chilling indifference, the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. He didn't expect her to answer, he expected her to shrink, to murmur an apology, to disappear back into the background where she belonged. The air crackled with unspoken assumptions, about her race, her age, her uniform. For a long moment, Mary simply stood, the weight of 18 years of invisibility pressing down on her. Then, with a breath so quiet it was almost imperceptible, she began to walk towards the whiteboard. The space between the door and the whiteboard felt miles long, each step echoing unnaturally in the sudden, absolute silence of the room. The snickers had died, replaced by a confused, expectant hush. Mary could feel the collective gaze of 30 young minds, sharp, analytical, privileged, fixed on her back. They weren't just watching a janitor approach a complex physics problem, they were watching a fundamental law of their universe being challenged. As she reached the front, the sheer complexity of the equation seemed to leap out at her, elegant, terrifying, familiar. Dr. Finch stepped aside, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips, arms crossed, radiating smug certainty. He offered her a fresh piece of chalk with a flourish that bordered on parody. Mary took it. The chalk felt cool, smooth, a forgotten extension of herself. Her mind, for a moment, wasn't in room 307. It was decades earlier, in the hallowed, unforgiving halls of MIT. She saw herself, younger, fiercer, hunched over proofs late into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning desire to unravel the universe's secrets. She remembered the thrill of discovery, the beauty of mathematical logic unfolding like poetry. She also remembered the subtle dismissals, the research borrowed, without credit by a lauded male colleague, the advisor who suggested her aptitude might be better suited to less demanding fields, the whispers that followed her down corridors, whispers that sounded remarkably like the ones she'd just heard. And then, the crushing weight of family tragedy, her brilliant younger brother's sudden, debilitating illness, the medical bills that swallowed every penny, forcing her to abandon her doctoral work just shy of completion, burying a future filled with equations under layers of necessity and silence. That buried past surged forward now, not as pain, but as pure, focused energy. The years of sweeping floors and scrubbing toilets hadn't erased the pathways in her brain. They had simply lain dormant, waiting. Her hand rose, steady and sure. The first stroke of chalk against the board was sharp, decisive. A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Mary didn't write tentatively, she wrote with the fluid confidence of innate understanding. Symbols flowed, manipulations unfolded with breathtaking logic. She wasn't just copying or guessing, she was thinking, solving, weaving through the mathematical intricacies with a grace that belied the calluses on her fingers. The initial confusion on the students' faces morphed into wide-eyed disbelief, then grudging, undeniable awe. They recognized the elegance of her approach, the shortcuts she took that had eluded them, the intuitive leaps that bridged complex gaps. They were witnessing not just a solution, but a masterclass. Behind her, Dr. Finch's smirk had vanished, replaced by stark astonishment. His arms uncrossed, his posture stiffened. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes narrowed, scrutinizing every line she wrote. The foundation of his intellectual superiority, built on years of accolades and the assumption of his own singular brilliance, was cracking. He saw not random marks, but a profound understanding that mirrored, perhaps even surpassed, his own. Mary moved faster, the chalk dancing across the board, a cascade of symbols building towards a final, irrefutable conclusion. The air vibrated with unspoken questions, with the shattering of preconceived notions. When the final term clicked into place, completing the proof, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged with the weight of revelation. Mary carefully placed the chalk in the holder. She turned, not looking at the stunned students, but directly into Dr. Alastair Finch's disbelieving eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, devoid of triumph or accusation, yet it resonated with decades of suppressed knowledge. The boundary condition requires a non-perturbative approach, she stated simply. You neglected the ghost fields in the path integral, and in the profound, echoing silence, the dust from the chalk slowly settled, coating the polished floor she would later have to clean. The spell broke not with applause, but with a collective, uneasy shifting. Whispers erupted, hushed but urgent, filled with disbelief and a dawning shame. Did you see that? How? Finch didn't even catch the ghost fields. The students exchanged glances, their usual confident banter replaced by stunned silence or awkward murmurs. The intellectual hierarchy of Evergreen Academy had just been inverted by the woman who cleaned their messes. Dr. Finch stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, humiliation, and a sliver of grudging, purely intellectual respect warring with deeply ingrained arrogance. He stared at the elegant, completed proof on the board, then at Mary, as if trying to reconcile the two realities. He opened his mouth, then closed it, incapable of formulating a response that wouldn't further expose his own folly. Mary, without another word, retrieved her cart and quietly exited the room, leaving behind a tableau of fractured certainty. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, a steady rhythm against the backdrop of stunned silence she left in her wake. Back in the anonymity of the hallway, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache. It wasn't triumph she felt, but a profound weariness, the resurfacing of old griefs for a life unlived. News of the incident spread through Evergreen Academy like wildfire, transmitted through texts, hushed conversations in the library, and coded glances across the dining hall. It became the stuff of instant legend, the janitor who schooled Dr. Finch. The reactions were varied. Some students expressed genuine awe and righteous anger at Finch's condescension. Others felt a vicarious embarrassment, recognizing their own passive participation in the school's subtle caste system. A cynical few dismissed it as a fluke, a lucky guess, unable to accept the implications. The faculty buzzed, torn between astonishment and a desire to manage the narrative, to smooth over this disruption to the established order. Later that afternoon, as Mary was meticulously cleaning the brass fixtures on the main staircase, Dr. Finch approached her. He looked pale, his usual crisp composure frayed at the edges. He stopped a few steps away, clearly uncomfortable, struggling for words. "Mary," he began, the name sounding awkward on his lips. "This morning, the equation." He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology. My behavior was inappropriate. Unprofessional." Mary paused her polishing, meeting his gaze steadily. Her expression was unreadable. "It was more than unprofessional, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice low but clear. "It was dismissive. You didn't see a person. You saw a uniform." Finch flinched slightly. "Yes. You're right. But, your solution, it was remarkable. Where did you study?" The question, though perhaps intended to bridge the gap, still carried a trace of analytical detachment, as if her intellect were a specimen to be classified. Mary held his gaze, refusing to be reduced to her academic history. "I studied life, Dr. Finch. The kind that forces you to choose between feeding your family and feeding your mind. The kind that teaches you resilience in ways equations never can." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "An apology is noted. But understanding why it was necessary is more important." She picked up her polishing cloth again, turning back to the brass fixture, the simple, repetitive motion a quiet assertion of her own space, her own dignity. Finch stood there for another moment, grappling with a discomfort that went beyond mere social awkwardness. He had been confronted not just with unexpected brilliance, but with the human consequence of his own casual prejudice. Finally, murmuring something incoherent, he turned and walked away, leaving Mary alone with the gleaming brass and the lingering scent of polish. The surface might shine, but the reflections were now undeniably fractured. The story of Mary Jackson and the quantum entanglement equation refused to stay within Evergreen's ivy-covered walls. It leaked onto local blogs, sparked threads on elite university forums, and became a minor sensation, a modern parable of hidden genius and humbled arrogance. Mary found herself, bewilderingly, becoming a symbol. She was lauded by some as an icon of resilience, a testament to overlooked black brilliance. Others saw her as a convenient narrative, a feel-good story that allowed people to congratulate themselves on recognizing injustice without actually addressing its roots. Dr. Evelyn Reed, Evergreen Academy's pragmatic and image-conscious head of school, recognized both the opportunity and the threat. An incident like this could tarnish the school's carefully cultivated reputation, but spun correctly, it could also showcase its, newly discovered, commitment to inclusivity. She summoned Mary to her expansive, minimalist office, the view overlooking the pristine campus a stark contrast to Mary's usual subterranean break room. "Mary," Dr. Reed began, her tone warm but carefully measured, "I wanted to speak with you directly about the events in Dr. Finch's class. And about the attention it's garnered." She gestured vaguely towards her monitor. "Firstly, let me reiterate Dr. Finch's apology on behalf of the Academy. Such behavior is unacceptable." Mary nodded politely, waiting. "Your display of knowledge was, by all accounts, extraordinary," Dr. Reed continued, leaning forward. "It has prompted much discussion here. We feel your talents are being underutilized." She paused for effect. Evergreen would like to offer you the Alastair Finch Fellowship for Theoretical Advancement. It's a newly established position, part mentorship for promising students, part independent research, with a generous stipend. It would give you the platform you deserve. It was a tempting offer. A chance, decades late, to step back into the world she'd been forced to leave. A title, resources, recognition. But as Mary looked at Dr. Reed's earnest, calculating eyes, she saw the mechanism at work, the institution attempting to absorb the disruption, to sanitize her story, to make her a manageable part of its narrative. She smiled faintly, a smile tinged with weary wisdom. Dr. Reed, I appreciate the offer more than you know. 30 years ago, I would have wept with gratitude for such an opportunity. Her gaze drifted towards the window, then back to the head of school. But a fellowship, a title, that doesn't change the fact that for 18 years, I was invisible here until I solved an equation. It doesn't change the experiences of other support staff, maybe less vocal or less extraordinary than me, who face dismissiveness every day. It doesn't fix the underlying assumptions that made Dr. Finch's actions possible in the first place. She took a quiet breath. My value, Dr. Reed, isn't validated by a fellowship. It exists regardless. What Evergreen needs isn't to give me a special title, but to genuinely examine the culture that requires a genius janitor narrative to recognize the inherent dignity of all its members. The responsibility for change lies with the institution, not just in celebrating an anomaly. Dr. Reed looked momentarily taken aback, her practiced composure faltering. She had expected gratitude, perhaps negotiation, not a gentle but firm deflection that placed the onus squarely back on Evergreen itself. I see, she said slowly. We are, of course, implementing new diversity and inclusion initiatives. Mary simply nodded again, the silence speaking volumes. She hadn't sought the spotlight, hadn't asked to become a symbol. Now, the weight of that unsolicited role felt heavy. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was a narrative others were projecting onto her, a burden of expectation she carried alongside her cleaning cart. Declining the fellowship felt less like a rejection of opportunity and more like an act of preserving her own hard-won peace, refusing to become a convenient plaster over a systemic crack. Months settled over Evergreen Academy like fine dust. The story of Mary Jackson became less of a headline and more of a fixture in the school's institutional memory, referenced in DI workshops and occasionally brought up in hushed tones by new students. Change, when it came, was subtle, incremental. Dr. Finch, chastened, made halting efforts to diversify his syllabus and seemed genuinely more mindful in his interactions, though a certain intellectual frostiness remained ingrained. Dr. Reed proudly pointed to newly formed committees and mandatory sensitivity training, progress measured in meeting minutes and strategic plans. Some students, profoundly impacted, actively worked to challenge the school's elitist undercurrents, others, inevitably, moved on, the incident fading into anecdote. Mary continued her work. The overt condescension had vanished, replaced by a careful, sometimes awkward respect. Students and staff greeted her by name, held doors open, offered hesitant smiles. But she was still categorized, now as the genius janitor, a curiosity, an exception that proved a rule many still implicitly believed. The respect felt different, filtered through the lens of her revealed intellect, not simply granted as a human right. It was better than invisibility, perhaps, but it wasn't freedom. One evening, long after the students and faculty had departed, Mary found herself cleaning room 307. The scent of whiteboard markers hung in the still air. Dr. Finch had left a new equation sketched out, sprawling and intricate, perhaps a problem for his seminar, perhaps his own research. Mary paused, her gaze tracing the complex symbols. Years of practice allowed her to see the flow, the potential pitfalls, the underlying structure. She noticed a subtle flaw in the initial conditions, a small assumption that would likely lead to a dead end weeks down the line. For a moment, her fingers twitched, the phantom feel of chalk cool against her skin. The old fire, the intellectual thrill, flickered within her. She could walk over, pick up a marker, make the correction. A small, anonymous act of intellectual engagement. It would be so easy, but then she stopped. She looked at the equation, a problem waiting for a solution, suspended in the quiet room. She thought of the fellowship offered and declined, the committee's meeting, the careful respect that still felt like a form of separation. She thought of the decades lost and the peace she had finally, painstakingly, carved out for herself. Solving their equations, whether on the board or in their institutional structures, wasn't her burden to carry alone. With a quiet sigh, Mary Jackson turned away from the whiteboard, from the elegant, flawed equation waiting in the dim light. She pushed her cleaning cart out of the silent classroom and continued her rounds, her footsteps echoing softly down the long, polished corridor. The unwritten equations hung in the air behind her, their solutions uncertain, their responsibility dispersed, waiting for hands other than hers to finally write the answers. The question lingered in the empty spaces: had anything truly fundamental changed, or was the gleam just buffed brighter on the same old surfaces?